Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because the story you're about to hear is one most people would never dare to tell. Broken Heart. It's a confession about loneliness, temptation, and the kind of emotional connection that changes a person forever. A woman shares her truth, not to justify what happened, but to finally let go of the guilt that's been haunting her since that summer. Cloud with rain. So, grab a moment for yourself, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reflection of what happens when love fades, and silence becomes louder than vows. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe now, because every week we bring you real stories, real emotions, and the kind of truth that keeps you thinking long after the video ends. I still remember the heat of that summer, the way it clung to everything like a secret that refused to stay buried. My husband had been traveling for work, chasing contracts that seemed to matter more than our marriage lately. I told myself I understood, bills had to be paid, futures secured. But deep down, I knew what I really missed wasn't money, it was presence. It was warmth. It was being seen. When Daniel, my stepson, called to say he'd be spending his university break with us, I was genuinely happy. It had been almost 3 years since I'd last seen him, and back then he was just a lanky teenager who barely made eye contact. Now he was 21, grown, confident, with that quiet kind of charm that reminded me too much of what I'd lost with his father. The first day he arrived, the house felt different. Fuller. Livelier. His laugh echoed down the hallway, his voice carried from the kitchen. And for the first time in months, I caught myself smiling for no reason. He helped with groceries, cooked with me, even fixed the leaking tap his father had ignored for weeks. It felt easy. Natural. But underneath that ease was something I didn't want to name. Something I brushed off every time our hands touched over the counter, or when I caught his gaze lingering longer than it should. I told myself it was nothing, just the warmth of family returning. Just summer light playing tricks on my heart. But nights became heavier. Silence turned louder. There was one night, and I'll never forget it, when the power went out after a storm. The house was swallowed by darkness. I was half asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart leapt. For a moment I thought it was my husband, back early. But the footsteps stopped at my door. "Are you awake?" It was Daniel's voice. Calm. Low. I turned in bed, pretending to be half asleep. "What is it?" "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said. Something about the softness in his tone disarmed me. I told him I was fine, and he murmured goodnight. But as he turned to leave, I felt that strange electricity again, the one that made my chest tighten and my breath slow. I hated it. I feared it. But I couldn't deny it. After that night, I became aware of everything. The way his eyes followed me when I laughed. The way he'd linger in the doorway, waiting for me to start a conversation. The way he said my name, not stepmom, not any title, just my name. Each morning, I'd stand in front of the mirror and remind myself of who I was, the wife, a mother, a woman who had promised to stay loyal. But in the quiet corners of my mind, that promise began to sound less like devotion and more like a sentence. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to even feel possible. Yet, every day, something invisible pulled us closer, like the universe itself was testing how far a human heart could bend before it broke. By the time my husband called one evening to say he'd be extending his trip another week, I knew something inside me had already shifted. I knew because when Daniel walked into the room, smiled that soft, unassuming smile, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie together, I didn't say no. That was the night the line between what was right and what felt real began to blur. And I've been living with the echo of that choice ever since. The following days were a blur of quiet moments and unspoken thoughts. I kept telling myself that what I felt for Daniel was just loneliness dressed up as connection, that if my husband were home, none of this would even cross my mind. But every time I tried to believe that, Daniel would walk into the room, and everything inside me would betray the lie. One evening, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky had turned gray, threatening rain, and the whole house seemed to hum with a restless stillness. I'd been cleaning the living room when Daniel appeared behind me. "You've been busy all day," he said softly, leaning against the doorway. "You should rest a bit." His tone wasn't teasing. It carried concern, maybe even affection, and that caught me off guard. I smiled weakly, wiping my hands on a towel. "I'm fine. I just don't like being idle." He stepped closer. "You don't have to fill every silence," he said. "Sometimes it's okay to just sit." Something about that sentence stayed with me. I'd spent years filling silences, with chores, with routines, with meaningless calls to a husband who was always somewhere else. I'd forgotten how to simply exist in someone's presence. That night, the rain finally came. Hard. It drummed on the roof like an untamed rhythm, drowning the world outside. The lights flickered again, and I found myself in the dim glow of a single candle in the living room. Daniel came in quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I thought you might want one," he said, handing me a cup. "Thank you," I whispered. Our fingers brushed. For a second, neither of us pulled away. We sat there in silence, listening to the rain. There was no music, no laughter, just the low hum of something neither of us could name. When I finally turned to look at him, his eyes weren't the eyes of a boy anymore. They were steady, searching, waiting for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I shouldn't," I said suddenly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, like he understood every battle happening inside me. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't want to hurt you." That sentence broke something in me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Not with expectation, but with empathy. Like he saw right through every wall I had built to survive a marriage that had long since gone silent. I stood, pretending to tidy up, desperate to escape the gravity between us. But as I moved, he rose too. The sound of rain filled the space where our words failed. Then, in that fragile silence, our eyes met again, and for one fleeting heartbeat, it felt like the universe had stopped breathing. I didn't cross that line. Not then. Not physically. But something shifted forever in that moment. The boundaries I'd once believed were unbreakable had cracked. And even though nothing happened, I knew it already had, in the space between our thoughts, in the electricity of restraint, in the shared understanding that some things, once felt, can never be unfelt. That night, when I finally lay down in bed, the storm outside began to fade, but inside me, it only grew louder. I tried to convince myself it was guilt, not desire. I tried to pray it away, to bury it under reason. But all I could see when I closed my eyes was Daniel's face, and that quiet promise in his eyes that scared me more than anything else, the promise that he saw me. And that kind of recognition is the most dangerous form of temptation, because it doesn't demand anything from you. It simply reminds you of everything you've been missing. The next morning felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself knew that something unspoken had settled between us. Daniel greeted me with his usual warmth, polite, calm, effortless, but I could feel the shift. There was no more pretending. We both knew that we had stepped too close to a line that neither of us had planned to approach. I kept myself busy that day. I cooked, cleaned, folded laundry that didn't need folding. I tried to focus on everything that reminded me of my husband, the framed pictures, the old notes, the scent of his cologne that had faded from the dresser. But even those reminders felt distant, like they belonged to another life. Daniel spent most of the afternoon outside, fixing the garden fence. I watched from the kitchen window as he worked, sleeves rolled up, focus unwavering. He looked so much like his father at that age, determined, quiet, but with a spark his father had long since lost. That resemblance should have comforted me. Instead, it tore at something inside me. When he came in later, his hands were dirty, his shirt damp from sweat. "The fence is done," he said, smiling with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from honest effort. Thank you, I replied softly. Your dad will appreciate it. He hesitated, then said, I didn't do it for him. That silence afterward was louder than thunder. I wanted to say something, to correct him, to steer the moment away from whatever emotion was swelling between us, but the words wouldn't come. Later that evening, as I sat reading in the living room, Daniel appeared again. He hesitated by the doorway, almost as if asking permission to step in. Can we talk? He asked. I nodded, setting the book aside. He took a seat across from me, elbows resting on his knees. I don't want to make things awkward, he began, his voice low and sincere. I know you're married. I know this shouldn't even be in my head. But I can't stop thinking about that night. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. Daniel, we didn't do anything wrong. I know, he said quickly. But that's what scares me. Because it still feels like we did. His honesty was disarming. It stripped away every layer of rationality I'd built to protect myself. I wanted to be angry, to tell him he was crossing a line, but instead, I just sat there, caught between guilt and something I didn't have the courage to name. Daniel, I said after a long pause, you're young. You're confused. I'm lonely, he finished gently. The word hung in the air like smoke. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't deny it. Because he was right. I was lonely, in my own home, in my own marriage, in a life that had stopped feeling alive years ago. He stood slowly, almost reluctantly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. I'll give you space, he said quietly. I just needed to be honest. When he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair where he'd been. The truth was, I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at myself, for needing that honesty, for craving the feeling of being wanted, even if it came from the one person it never should have. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking clock, the faint sound of his footsteps in the hallway. I wanted to pretend none of this was happening, to erase it from my memory, but the heart doesn't erase what it secretly treasures. At one point, I got up, walked to the mirror, and stared at my reflection. I saw a woman who was still trying to be good, but losing faith in what that even meant. I saw a flicker of life returning, not from love, but from danger. And that terrified me more than anything. I didn't cross that boundary, not with my hands, not with my actions. But inside, I already had. The emotional betrayal had begun long before I ever realized it. And once you taste that kind of connection, the kind that feels forbidden but real, nothing else ever feels the same again. The days that followed were thick with silence. Daniel and I spoke less, but the quiet between us said more than words ever could. It wasn't avoidance, it was restraint, the kind that hurts more than indulgence. Every glance, every polite smile, felt loaded with everything we weren't saying. I threw myself into housework, desperate to drown my thoughts in chores. I repainted the guest room, reorganized the pantry, even volunteered to help a neighbor with her garden, anything to keep from being in the same space with him for too long. But guilt has a way of lingering. It doesn't need company to grow, it feeds on memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on his face that night, not desire, not defiance, but understanding. That was what haunted me most. He understood me in a way my husband no longer could. And that realization felt like betrayal in its purest form. My husband called one evening while I was folding laundry. His voice was cheerful, distracted, full of stories about business meetings and deadlines. He didn't ask how I was, not really. It was as if our conversations had become transactions, each word a routine exchange of obligation. After I hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. The guilt hit me hard. How could I crave someone else's company when I'd promised my loyalty to this man? But then another truth whispered back, when was the last time he'd truly been loyal to me? Daniel must have sensed something that evening. He kept his distance, staying mostly in his room, yet I could hear him moving around. The faint creak of floorboards above me was both a comfort and a curse. He was there, but unreachable, and that, somehow, made the ache worse. That night, sleep refused to come. I tossed and turned, sheets tangled around me like the consequences I was trying to escape. Around midnight, I gave up. I got up, walked into the living room, and sat in the dark. The clock ticked softly, a sound I'd always associated with patience, but now it felt like punishment. Minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. He paused by the doorway. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked gently. I shook my head. Too many thoughts. He came closer, keeping a respectful distance. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain starting again outside, the same rhythm that had marked that first stormy night. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said after a moment. "I already do," I replied. My voice cracked on the words. He hesitated, as if debating whether to speak. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "You're not a bad person for needing to feel alive." Tears stung my eyes before I could stop them. I didn't know if it was his kindness or my exhaustion, but the weight of everything suddenly felt unbearable. I turned away, hiding my face, ashamed of the emotions spilling out. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch me. He just stood there, a quiet witness to my unraveling. Somehow, that restraint meant more than any embrace could have. It was respect wrapped in longing. After a while, I managed to whisper, "You should go to bed, Daniel." He nodded slowly. "Good night," he said, his voice barely audible. When he was gone, I sat there until the first light crept through the curtains. The guilt hadn't faded, but something inside me had shifted again. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't about Daniel anymore. It was about me, about the version of myself I had buried under years of neglect and silence. I wasn't proud of what I felt, but I couldn't hate it either. Because for the first time in a long while, I felt human again. And that simple truth was both my salvation and my sin. The last week of summer came quietly. The days were shorter, the air a little cooler, and everything inside the house seemed to hold its breath. Daniel was packing to return to campus, and though neither of us said it, we both knew that once he left, life would fall back into its old rhythm, or at least pretend to. I busied myself with practical things, folding his clothes, cooking extra meals for his journey, asking about his schedule as though I cared only about logistics. But underneath it all was a current of something unspoken, a sadness that sat heavy in my chest. The night before his departure, we ended up in the living room again. It wasn't planned. He had come down to say goodnight, and I was already sitting there, lost in thought. He paused, uncertain. I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Sit," I said softly. For a long while, we didn't speak. The air between us was full of everything we'd left unsaid over those long, tense weeks. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'll miss this place," he said quietly. I nodded, keeping my gaze fixed on the candle flickering between us. "I'll miss the company," I admitted. There was no hidden meaning in my words, and yet, there was. He leaned forward slightly, his expression open and vulnerable. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I already know." I looked up then, meeting his eyes for what felt like the last time. In them, I saw understanding, not of desire, but of restraint. Of something we had both chosen not to become, even when it would have been easier to give in. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said softly. He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "I think I already did. Just not at the right time." That sentence lingered in the room long after he'd gone upstairs. I sat there until the candle melted into silence, realizing that no matter how much time passed, this summer would stay etched in both our memories, not for what happened, but for what didn't. The next morning, when he left, I stood at the door and waved. The house felt colder as his car disappeared down the street. I walked back inside, every corner echoing with his absence. When my husband returned 2 weeks later, everything appeared normal. He kissed my cheek, asked about the garden, talked about his business. I smiled in all the right places, laughed when expected, and went back to being the woman he believed I was. But inside, something had changed forever. It wasn't that I wanted Daniel, it was that he'd reminded me of something I had forgotten, what it felt like to be truly noticed. To have someone look at me as if I still mattered. The guilt never completely faded. Some nights, when I lie awake, I can still feel the quiet ache of that summer, the electricity that almost consumed me, the warmth of connection I was too afraid to embrace. I never told anyone. Not my husband, not my friends. This story has lived inside me, silent but alive, a ghost of a version of myself I once was. Maybe that's why I'm finally saying it here, anonymously, not to seek forgiveness, but to let it breathe. Because silence, too, can become a kind of punishment. Sometimes I wonder if Daniel ever thinks of me, if he remembers the long nights, the storm, the unspoken words. Maybe he's moved on, living a life untouched by the weight of it all. I hope so. As for me, I carry it quietly. It's a secret that shaped me, that reminded me how fragile boundaries can be when loneliness grows unchecked. And though I will never justify what I felt, I've learned that being human means sometimes walking too close to the edge, not because you want to fall, but because you've forgotten what standing still feels like. So yes, this is my confession. Not of betrayal, but of weakness. Of longing. Of rediscovering pieces of myself I didn't know were missing until they appeared in the reflection of someone I should never have noticed that way. And though time has softened the pain, the memory remains, like the fading glow of a sunset that once burned too bright. Disclaimer: this story contains mature emotional themes, sensitive relationship issues, and real-life reflections intended for adult audiences only. It is shared for storytelling and awareness purposes, not to promote or encourage infidelity, but to explore the human emotions behind difficult choices. Viewer discretion is advised. If this story touched you, don't just scroll away, take a second to hit that red heart-like button and subscribe to the channel. Broken Heart every week, we share real confessions and emotional journeys that reveal the hidden sides of love, loneliness, and human connection. Sparkles sometimes, the stories we tell aren't about right or wrong, they're about being human, about feeling too much, and learning to forgive ourselves for it. So if you believe in truth, emotion, and storytelling that speaks straight to the heart, this is your place. Speech balloon, drop a comment below. What would you have done in her shoes? Headphone, and remember, some stories are meant to be told, not to be judged. Candle, until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and always listen with your heart.